In the history of the Silent Kingdom, King Alaric was known as the Man of Stone. He never touched his queen. Not once. In 10 years of marriage, he never held her hand, never kissed her cheek, and never spoke a word of kindness to her in public. The world pitied Queen Evelina. They whispered that her husband hated her. They said her beauty was wasted on a king with a heart of ice. But the world was wrong. Alaric didn't refuse to touch her because he hated her. He refused to touch her because he was protecting her. In a court full of assassins and spies, a king's love is a death sentence. To show he loved her was to put a target on her back. Every cold look was a shield. Every silence was a vow. This is the story of a man who played the villain for 10 years just to keep the woman he loved alive. This is the secret of the Silent Crown. The Great Hall of the Iron Citadel was not a room built for comfort. It was a cavern of cold stone, designed to make men feel small and the law feel eternal. At the very end of this hall sat the Black Throne, and upon it sat King Alaric. He sat perfectly still. To the servants moving in the shadows, he looked like part of the masonry, a statue carved from the same dark rock as the walls. His hands rested on the armrests, his fingers long and powerful, but motionless. He did not fidget. He did not smile. He simply watched. Alaric was a man who had learned to breathe without moving his chest. He had learned to scream without opening his mouth. Because in this palace, every movement was a signal, and every signal was a risk. Tonight, the hall was empty, save for the flickering torches that struggled against the encroaching dark. This was the king's ritual. Every night, after the council had finished their bickering and the queen had retired to her lonely chambers, Alaric would sit here. Alone. He looked at the empty seat beside him. The queen's throne. It was smaller, carved from lighter wood, but it felt like a gaping wound in the room. He is a man of flint, the people whispered in the markets. A king who traded his heart for a crown. Alaric let out a breath that tasted like the cold soot of the fireplace. If only they knew. If only they could see the map of scars beneath his furs, or the way his pulse thundered every time Evelina entered a room. He remembered their wedding day, 5 years ago. He remembered the way she looked in her white lace, a creature of light entering a world of shadows. He had wanted to take her hand. He had wanted to lean in and whisper that he would spend his life making her happy. But as he stood at the altar, he saw the eyes. He saw Lord Rain in the front row, his gaze fixed not on the king, but on the queen's throat. He saw the southern envoys measuring her like a piece of land to be conquered. He realized in that heartbeat that if he showed the world how much he loved her, he was signing her death warrant. In this kingdom, the king's love was a target. So, on their wedding night, he had walked into her room, bolted the door, and stood by the window. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't even looked at her. The world must believe I am cold, he had told the shadows that night. Because as long as they think I don't care, they will leave her alone. Now, 5 years later, the plan was working. The lords thought the marriage was a failure. They thought the king was a man of stone who preferred the company of maps and swords to the warmth of a woman. And because they thought she was unloved, they ignored her. A floorboard creaked in the gallery above. Alaric's eyes shifted, but his head didn't move. A shadow detached itself from the pillar. It was Sir Tristan, the only man in the kingdom who knew the truth. Tristan walked forward, his iron boots making a rhythmic, heavy sound on the stone. He stopped 10 paces from the throne and bowed. "The perimeter is secure, Majesty," Tristan said. His voice was a low rasp. "The 3 who tried to scale the north wall, they will not be bothering the queen again." Alaric's hand tightened on the armrest, the only sign of his internal storm. Did she see them? She was reading by the fire, sire. She heard nothing but the wind. "Good," Alaric murmured. "And the southern spy?" "The one posing as a stable hand. He met with Lord Rain's messenger an hour ago. He believes the queen is miserable. He reported that you and her didn't exchange a single word during the midday meal. A bitter, twisted sense of satisfaction rose in Alaric's chest. Excellent. Let them report my cruelty. Let them write songs about the lonely queen. Every insult they throw at me is a shield for her. Tristan looked at his king. He saw the exhaustion in the man's eyes, the kind of tiredness that sleep couldn't fix. She is a strong woman, Alaric. But even the strongest wall needs a repair now and then. She thinks you hate her. I know, Alaric said. The words felt like swallowing glass. I need her to think about it. If she knows the truth, her eyes will give us away. She will look at me with hope, and Rain will see that hope and turn it into a noose. No. She must stay angry. She must stay distant. Alaric stood up. His heavy cloak, lined with the fur of a northern wolf, trailed behind him like a funeral shroud. He walked to the center of the hall, standing in the spot where he and Evelina had stood for their coronation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dried flower. A jasmine. She had dropped it in the hallway 3 days ago. He had waited until the hallway was empty, then knelt and picked it up as if it were a diamond. He held it to his nose. It smelled of her. It smelled of a life he couldn't have. I am the villain of her story, Tristan, Alaric said, his voice cracking for the first time. I am the monster in her bedchamber and the ghost at her table. But she is alive. She is breathing. And in this den of wolves, that is the only victory I care about. He turned and began the long walk toward his private study. He wouldn't go to her room tonight. He wouldn't go to her room tomorrow. He would continue to be the man of stone. Because he loved her enough to let her hate him. He loved her enough to be the king who never touched her. And as the torches in the hall flickered and died, leaving the room in total darkness, Alaric's footsteps were the only sound, the steady, lonely beat of a heart that was breaking in silence to keep a kingdom and a woman whole. The sun rose over the iron citadel not with warmth, but with a harsh, unforgiving glare. For Queen Evelina, the morning light was not a welcome friend, it was the signal to put on her own suit of armor. Her armor was made of silk, gold thread, and a face that showed absolutely nothing. She sat in her vanity while her handmaidens worked in a silence so thick it was suffocating. They brushed her hair with silver combs, pinned her veils with emerald brooches, and painted her lips a deep, blood red. They did not speak to her. In the court's eyes, the queen was a tragic figure, a beautiful bird in a gilded cage whose master had forgotten she existed. Evelina looked at her reflection. She saw the forgotten queen. But behind her eyes, she carried the fire of a woman who knew a secret the world did not. She remembered the warmth of Alaric's chest from the night before, the way he had held her in the dark as if he were afraid she would turn to smoke. But as the heavy doors of her chambers opened, that memory was locked away in a box. The king is waiting in the great hall, Majesty, a footman announced, his head bowed. He didn't look at her. No one did. Evelina stood, her skirts rustling like the sound of dry leaves. Then we shall not keep the king waiting. The council chamber was a long, vaulted room filled with the smell of old parchment and the sour breath of powerful men. At the center was the great table, a slab of oak as old as the kingdom itself. Alaric was already there. He was seated at the head, surrounded by his advisors. Lord Rain sat to his right, leaning in, whispering something into the king's ear. Alaric didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge Evelina as she entered. She took her seat to his left. There was a gap between their chairs, barely 3 inches of space, but to the lords watching, it might as well have been the Great Sea. We were discussing the northern tides, Majesty, Lord Rain said, his voice smooth and oily. He turned his predator's smile toward Evelina. Though, I fear the details might be too tedious for the Queen's ears. Perhaps she would prefer the gardens. Evelina felt the insult like a slap. She looked at Alaric. She waited for him to defend her. She waited for the king to remind Rain that she was the daughter of a great house and a ruler in her own right. Alaric didn't look at her. He didn't even blink. He reached for a bowl of fruit on the table, his hand passing inches from hers. The queen is here to represent the crown's presence, reign, Alaric said, his voice as flat and grey as a tombstone. She does not need to understand the coin to sit in the chair. Continue. The lords shared a knowing look. A few of them smirked behind their hands. Evelina felt the heat rise in her neck, a genuine flash of anger that she didn't have to fake. Even though she knew why he did it, the sting was real. The loneliness of being publicly discarded was a weight that grew heavier every day. For 3 hours, the meeting dragged on. Alaric treated her like a piece of furniture. He asked for the opinions of the bishop, the general, and even the master of the stables, but he never once turned his head to the left. Evelina sat perfectly still. She watched the way Alaric's signet ring caught the light. She noticed the slight tension in his jaws, a tiny muscle that only twitched when he was lying. She realized he wasn't listening to Rain at all. He was counting. He was measuring the room. He was playing the part of the bored, indifferent husband so perfectly that even the spies were starting to look away, convinced there was nothing to see here. And what of the southern border? The bishop asked. The people say the queen's family is restless. They say the southern lords feel their daughter is being overlooked. The room went silent. This was the trap. If Alaric defended her, he admitted he cared. If he insulted her family, he risked a civil war. Alaric picked up a knife and began to peel an apple. The blade was wicked and sharp. The southern lords are like children, Alaric said, the skin of the apple curling away in a single, perfect spiral. They want attention. Give them a new trade route and a few bags of gold, and they will forget who is being overlooked. My marriage is a political contract, Bishop. Not a romantic ballad. The queen knows her place, and I know mine. Evelina stood up. The sound of her chair scraping against the stone was like a scream. If the king is finished with his contract for the morning, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of practiced theatre and raw exhaustion, I find the air in this room has become quite foul. I shall take my leave. She didn't wait for permission. She turned and swept out of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. Back in the hallway, she leaned against a pillar, her eyes closed. He is doing it for you. She opened her eyes. Sir Tristan was standing there, his hand on the hilt of his sword. His iron armor glinted in the torchlight. I know, Evelina whispered. But Tristan, sometimes I forget what his real voice sounds like. I only hear the king's voice. The one made of ice. The ice is what keeps the rot away, Majesty, Tristan said softly. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a level that no servant could overhear. Rain was watching your face the entire time. He was looking for a crack. If you had smiled, or if the king had touched your hand. Rain would have sent the order to the assassins before noon. You are alive because he is cold. Never forget that. Evelina looked down the long, windowless hallway. She saw the servants watching her. She saw the spies in the shadows. She straightened her back, wiped a stray tear before it could fall, and lifted her chin. I won't forget, she said. She walked away, her footsteps echoing through the citadel. To the world, she was the queen who had just been humiliated by her husband. But in her heart, she was the queen who was helping her king win a war that no one else could see. The 3-inch canyon between them was not a distance of hate. It was a trench, dug deep and wide, to keep the enemy from crossing over into the only thing they had left, each other. While the court whispered about a king who didn't care, Sir Tristan was busy proving the opposite. On the rain-slicked north wall, 3 silhouettes moved like smoke. They were northern blades, carrying poisoned steel meant for the queen's throat. Tristan didn't call for the guard. A public alarm would alert the spies that the queen was a target. The struggle was silent and brutal. In the narrow laundry passage, Tristan met them. He used his shield as a hammer and his dagger as a scalpel. Within minutes, the threat was gone. No one heard the screams. No one saw the bodies. Later, in the king's study, Alaric looked at his knight's blood-stained gauntlet. She slept through the night, Tristan reported. Alaric's hand trembled as he gripped his desk. Good. Let her think the palace is a sanctuary. Let her think I am the only monster she has to fear. As long as she hates me, she is safe. In the wide, windowless West Gallery, Lord Julian blocked the Queen's path. He spoke with a voice of honey and poison. The king treats you like a ghost, Evelina, Julian whispered, leaning too close. The South has a throne waiting for a queen who is actually seen. Why stay with a man of stone? Evelina didn't flinch. She knew the servants were listening. She knew the spies were recording her every breath. The sun is silent, Julian, she replied, her voice echoing off the stone. Yet it holds the world together. If you think the king's silence is weakness, you are a fool. I suggest you leave before the cold of this house freezes your tongue. She walked away, her heart heavy. She had defended the man who had ignored her at breakfast, playing her part in a war where the only reward was another day of survival. The West Gallery was a place where the sun never reached. It was a massive, windowless artery of stone that connected the Queen's private solar to the rest of the citadel. To some, its width was a sign of grandeur, but to Evelina, it felt like a stage where she was always being watched. Silver sconces lined the walls, their flames flickering in the stagnant air. The scent of heavy floor wax and old incense hung low, never quite masking the smell of damp stone. And, as always, there were the servants. They stood like statues in their grey tunics, eyes downcast, ears open. In this hall, a whisper carried further than a shout. Evelina walked down the center of the gallery, the heavy silk of her crimson gown dragging behind her like a trail of blood. She was alone, or as alone as a queen could ever be. Majesty! The voice was smooth, cultured, and carried a warmth that felt out of place in the cold citadel. Evelina stopped. Standing near a tapestry depicting a hunt was Lord Julian. He was young, his hair the color of spun gold, and his eyes full of a sympathy that felt far too practiced. Lord Julian, Evelina said, her voice a calm, royal mask. I did not expect to see the South's favorite son so far from the gardens. Julian stepped into her path, bowing low. When he rose, he didn't move back. He stayed just a little too close, a daring move in a hallway filled with the king's eyes. The gardens are beautiful, Majesty, but they lack the conversation I crave, Julian said. He looked at her, his expression softening into something that looked dangerously like pity. I saw you at the council today. I saw the way the king spoke to you. Or rather, the way he didn't. Evelina felt the servant's ears twitch. She knew this was a test. Julian wasn't just a lord, he was a representative of the southern factions who wanted to see if the queen was ready to betray her cold husband. The king has many things on his mind, Julian, she replied, her tone sharpening. The weight of a crown is not easily shared with the trivialities of small talk. Is that what you call it? Trivialities. Julian stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. Evelina, the whole court sees it. You are a jewel being kept in a dark box. You defend a man who treats you like a ghost. There are those in the South, those with power and armies, who believe you deserve a throne where you are seen. Not ignored. This was it. The hostage gambit. The coup. If she agreed with him, if she even sighed in frustration, Julian would have the leverage he needed to tell the South that the Queen was ready to be liberated. Evelina looked past him. At the far end of the hall, she saw a man in iron armor. It wasn't Tristan, but one of his lieutenants. The king was watching. He was always watching. You speak of jewels and boxes, Lord Julian, as if I am a merchant's daughter to be bartered, Evelina said, her voice rising so that every servant in the gallery could hear. You think the king's silence is a sign of his indifference? You are mistaken. The sun is silent, yet it holds the world in its place. The deep ocean is silent, yet it can swallow entire fleets. She took a step toward him, forcing Julian to retreat. The king provides the stone of this castle. I provide the spirit. If you think my marriage is a weakness you can exploit, then you do not understand the strength of the crown. I suggest you return to the South, Lord Julian. The air in the citadel is clearly too heavy for your lungs. Julian's smile didn't falter, but his eyes grew dark. He bowed again, but this time, the respect was gone. As you wish, Majesty. But even the strongest wall crumbles when the frost stays too long. I hope your silent suns warms you when the winter truly begins. He turned and walked away, his boots clicking rhythmically against the stone. Evelina stood in the center of the wide hallway. She felt the eyes of the servants boring into her back. She had defended the man who had publicly insulted her only hours before. She had protected the king who wouldn't even look at her. She felt a sudden, sharp wave of loneliness. It was one thing to know the plan, it was another to live it every single second of the day. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run to the great hall and demand that Alaric hold her. But she didn't move. She adjusted her sleeves, smoothed her hair, and continued walking toward her chambers. In this windowless hall, she had just won a battle without a single drop of blood. She had proven that the queen was not a victim. She was a soldier. And like all soldiers, she had to learn to live with the silence of the trenches. She reached the door to her solar and paused. For a moment, she thought she felt a presence in the shadows, a familiar, heavy scent of sandalwood and cold iron. Alaric, she whispered to the empty air. There was no answer. Only the flicker of the torches and the distant, muffled sound of a heavy door closing somewhere deep in the castle. She went inside and shut the door. The hallway remained empty, wide, and silent. But the whispers had already begun to spread. The queen was loyal. The king was cold. And that silent crown was as heavy as it had ever been. The night had finally fallen over the iron citadel, bringing with it a silence that felt like a physical weight. In the queen's private solar, the fire had burned down to a low, pulsing orange. Evelina sat by the hearth, her crimson gown replaced by a simple robe of white wool. Without her jewels and her painted mask, she looked fragile, like a piece of porcelain kept in a room of iron. She listened to the sounds of the castle settling, the distant clank of a gate, the muffled call of a sentry. And then, she heard the sound she had been waiting for. 3 soft, rhythmic raps on the heavy oak door. Evelina rose, her heart thundering against her ribs. She didn't call for her ladies-in-waiting. They had been dismissed hours ago. She walked to the door and pulled back the heavy iron bolt. It slid with a metallic groan that seemed to echo through her very soul. The door opened, and Alaric stepped inside. He didn't look like a king. His heavy fur cloak was gone, and his tunic was wrinkled. He looked like a man who had spent the day at war with himself. He stepped into the room, and before the door was even fully closed, he reached back and slammed the bolt home. The sound of that bolt was the signal. The play was over. Alaric turned, and for the first time in 14 hours, he looked directly at her. His eyes weren't stone. They were full of a desperate, hungry fire. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. He didn't just hold her, he clung to her. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breathing ragged and uneven. Evelina wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the tension in his back, muscles pulled so tight they felt like they might snap. Alaric, she whispered, her voice trembling. Don't, he rasped, his voice a broken version of the one he used in the hall. Just stay still. Let me remember what it feels like to be human for a moment. They stood there for a long time, held together by the only honest embrace in the entire kingdom. In the dark, away from the spies and the windowless halls, the king was allowed to bleed. Finally, Alaric pulled back, though his hand stayed firmly on her shoulders. His thumbs traced the line of her collarbone, a touch so light it was almost a ghost of a sensation. I heard about Julian, Alaric said, his eyes searching hers. In the West Gallery. I was in the shadows. I heard every word you said. Then you heard me lie for you, Evelina said, a sad smile touching her lips. I told him the sun was silent. I told him your ice was a shield. It wasn't a lie, Evelina. Alaric's grip tightened, his expression turning fierce. Do you think I enjoyed watching him stand so close to you? Do you think I enjoyed hearing him offer you a better life while I sat in that hall and treated you like a stranger? He let go of her and began to pace the small room, his shadows dancing wildly on the stone walls. Rain is watching us like a hawk watching a rabbit. He is waiting for one sign of weakness. And in his mind, love is the greatest weakness of all. If he sees me touch your hand, he sees a way to control me. He sees a hostage. He sees a way to make the king of the Iron Citadel crawl on his knees. Alaric stopped and looked at her, his silhouette framed by the dying fire. I refuse to touch you today because I want them to think I have no heart. If they think I have no heart, they cannot break it. If they think you are nothing to me, they leave you in the shadows. And the shadows are the only place where you are safe. It is a lonely safety, Alaric, Evelina said, stepping toward him. It is the only safety I can give you, he shouted, the sound startling even him. He softened his voice immediately, glancing at the door. Every time I am cold to you, I am adding a year to your life. Every time I ignore you, I am pushing an assassin's blade away from your throat. I am playing the villain, Evelina. I am letting the world hate me. I am letting you hate me so that you can live. Evelina reached out and took his hand. His palm was calloused and cold, but as her fingers laced through his, he squeezed back with a strength that was almost painful. I don't hate you, she whispered. I hate the crown. I hate the throne. But I know who the man is behind the stone. Alaric pulled her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles. It wasn't a royal kiss. It was the kiss of a man who was starving. Tomorrow, the sun will rise, Alaric said, his forehead resting against hers. And I will be the monster again. I will walk past you. I will look through you. I will let the lords insult you and I will say nothing. And I will be the forgotten queen, she replied. But here, Alaric whispered, pulling her back into the heat of his embrace. Here, there is no king. There is no queen. There is only the truth. They sat together on the edge of the bed, the fire finally dying into ash. They didn't speak of politics or wars. They spoke of small things, of the way the wind sounded in the trees, of the dreams they used to have before the silence took over. For 2 hours, the silent crown was a myth. For 2 hours, the man of stone was just a man who loved a woman enough to stay away from her. And when the bells finally struck the hour of the wolf, Alaric stood up. He smoothed his tunic. He wiped the warmth from his eyes. He walked to the door, slid the bolt back, and became the ghost once more. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Because the only thing harder than refusing to touch her in the light was having to let go of her in the dark. On the highest roof of the citadel, Alaric stood against the gale. Below him, the world was a map of shadows. He pulled a dried jasmine flower from his pocket, a tiny, fragile piece of the woman he was forced to treat like a stranger. Rain thinks I am hollow, Alaric told the wind. He thinks I have no heart left to break. He let the flower go. The wind snatched it, whisking it into the dark abyss. Let him believe it. I will be the villain. I will be the shadow. As long as she wakes up tomorrow in a kingdom that isn't on fire, my soul is a small price to pay. The sentinel of the cloud stayed at his post, while far below, the queen dreamed of a husband who would one day come in from the cold. The great hall was a sea of hungry faces. Every lord of the realm had gathered, their ornate robes and fur-lined collars creating a mosaic of greed and ambition. At the center of it all was the long oak table, illuminated by 100 beeswax candles that dripped like slow, golden tears onto the wood. King Alaric sat at the head, his face a mask of iron. To his left, Evelina sat, her posture so rigid she looked as though she were made of marble. They had not spoken a word to each other since the sun rose. To the lords, they looked like a kingdom divided, a weak link in the chain of power. Lord Rain stood at the far end of the table. He was smiling, the smile of a man who believed he had already won. He held a map in one hand and a heavy scroll in the other. The time for silence has passed, Majesty, Rain's voice projected to the high, arched rafters. The northern clans are restless. The southern ports are closing. You sit on this throne and offer us nothing but cold looks and empty words. We need a treaty. We need the alliance of blood. He gestured to the scroll. The marriage of your daughter, Princess Ilara, to the High Chieftain of the North. It is the only way to save our borders. Sign it, or the lords of this table will find a king who will. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and betrayal. Alaric didn't move. He didn't even look at the scroll. He looked at Lord Rain as if he were an insect. You speak of a blood, Rain, Alaric said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that silenced the room. But you forgot that the Queen has a voice in the matters of her children. Rain laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. The Queen? You have ignored her for 5 years, Alaric. You treat her like a ghost. Why should she speak now? Evelina stood up. She didn't scream. She didn't shout. She simply rose from her chair, her crimson skirts catching the light like a spilled vintage. The movement was so sudden, so graceful, that every eye in the room snapped to her. Because a ghost sees things that the living miss, Evelina said. Her voice was a low, resonant bell. She reached into the folds of her gown and pulled out a bundle of letters. She tossed them onto the table. They slid across the wood, stopping right in front of the bishop. While you were busy thinking I was overlooked, Lord Rain, I was busy watching, Evelina continued, her eyes flashing with a fire that shocked the council. You speak of a high chieftain. But my scouts, men you thought were merely stable hands, have confirmed that the chieftain has been dead for weeks. These letters, signed in your own hand, prove that you weren't planning a wedding. You were planning a funeral. My daughter's funeral. And then, Alaric's. The silence that hit the room was physical. Rain's face didn't just pale, it turned the color of ash. He looked at the letters, then at the Queen, then at the King. For the first time in the entire meeting, Alaric turned his head to the left. He looked at his wife. He didn't smile. He didn't touch her. But in the depths of his grey eyes, there was a flash of pride so intense it was blinding. Asterisk, I gave you the silence, asterisk, his eyes said. Asterisk, and you used it to build a cage for our enemies. Asterisk. Lord Rain, Alaric said, standing up. His shadow stretched the length of the table, covering Rain in darkness. You thought my wife was a weakness. You thought because I didn't hold her hand in public, I didn't hold her heart in private. You were wrong. My silence wasn't a lack of love. It was a weapon. And you just walked right into the blade. Sir Tristan stepped forward from the shadows, his hand on the hilt of his broadsword. Behind him, 10 guards in iron armor blocked the exits. Seize him, Alaric commanded. Rain tried to speak, to lie, to bargain, but the words died in his throat. He was dragged from the hall, his boots scuffing against the stone he had hoped to rule. One by one, the other lords looked away, their heads bowed in sudden, terrified respect. They saw the truth now. The king and queen weren't divided. They were a two-headed dragon, and they had just scorched the room. The lords were dismissed. The great hall returned to its natural state, a tomb of echoes. Alaric and Evelina remained at the table. They sat side by side, still apart by those same 3 inches of oak. The candles were dying. The sun was setting. The letters were perfect, Evelina, Alaric whispered, his back still straight as an arrow. The distraction you provided was better, she replied. He stood up, his heavy furs rustling. He walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing the same lonely rhythm as always. He didn't touch her. He didn't say her name. But as he reached the threshold, he paused. The jasmine is in bloom in the south garden, he said, his back still turned. It is a brave flower. It grows best in the cold. He walked out, leaving her in the darkening hall. Evelina touched the amber pendant at her throat and smiled. She knew now that they would never walk hand in hand in the light of the court. They would never be the lovers the poet sang about. They were the king and queen of silence. And in that silence, they had conquered everything. The final test came at sunset. Alaric stood behind Evelina in her chambers. In the reflection of the window, he saw her longing. He saw the way she waited for him to just once, in the light of day, be her husband. He raised his hand. His fingers were an inch from her shoulder. He could feel her warmth. But then, he saw the glint of a spy's telescope on the distant wall. If he touched her, she became a target. If he showed love, he showed weakness. Alaric's hand curled into a white-knuckled fist. He pulled it back, hiding it behind his furs. "The execution is at dawn," he said, his voice as cold as a grave. "Stay inside." He walked out. He didn't look back. He had saved her life again, and all it cost him was the last piece of his heart. The great hall was finally empty. The traitors were in chains, and the spies had retreated into the night. Two high-backed chairs sat in the center of the cold stone floor, placed back to back. Alaric and Evelina sat there, their spines nearly touching, but their eyes facing opposite horizons. "Rain's allies have surrendered," Alaric said, his voice finally breaking under the weight of the day. "The kingdom is safe." "But we are still ghosts, Alaric," Evelina replied softly. "History will call you a tyrant. They will call me the Queen of Ash. They will say we were a tragedy." Alaric leaned his head back, just an inch away from hers. "Let them. Let the poet sing of lovers who died in the light. We are the ones who lived in the dark so our people could see the sun. I refuse to touch you tonight, and I will refuse tomorrow. Because my distance is the only wall they cannot climb." Evelina closed her eyes, feeling the heat of his presence behind her. "It is a heavy crown, my king. But we wear it together," he whispered. They stood up at the same time. He walked toward the north door, she walked toward the south. They didn't look back. They didn't say goodbye. Two people, one secret, and a love that was saved by the very silence that broke their hearts. True love does not always need to be seen to be real. Sometimes, the greatest sacrifice a heart can make is to stay silent, so that the person it loves can remain safe. Silence can be the loudest promise.